this computer. Excellent. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Nancy. Okay, now back to share screen. Okay. So anyway, we're saying that we had these teams, and in reality, according to our definition of how we do STS in a digital age, these were discretionary coalitions. We had 3 levels at which we were doing action research simultaneously. There was the day-to-day and weekly level, where we had the teams doing action research on projects that they had created with their NGO partners and with the villagers that we were working with. And there would be daily huddles, daily team meetings to be able to work on the different projects that were going on. And then the country directors, we had in each country 2 country directors, usually a male and a female, because we had volunteers that were male and female. We tried to reflect that. Although I did work in Uganda with 1 pair that were both female, and it worked out quite well, thank you. And so the country directors would do coaching and discussion, action research related with each of the team leaders on a daily and weekly basis. And then there was after action reviews that we did at the end of the weeks to be able to see cumulative what we were accomplishing and what resources need to be adjusted and so forth. It was a very dynamic kind of process. Now, at the end of a season, we would send people out in May and usually have them come back to the States in September. And we would, this season, during the season, there would also be weekly problem solving and decision making meetings over the telephone, online, between the executive director and country directors. And in some case, there would even be meetings with the teams themselves if they needed that kind of guidance. And then there were weekly country reports, and there were executive and in-country board visits. So that's where I ended up going numerous years into places like El Salvador, Guatemala, Thailand, Uganda, to be able to actually work boots on the ground on various kinds of projects. And then at the end of the season, we would have an after action review that would look at the whole season and all of the countries and see if there were lessons that we could tease out of this process. And then there was also a broader overarching review where we were trying to extract learning from the season in all the countries with all the projects and all the teams, and trying to say, okay, how do we apply what we've learned to the next season? So you had action research going on over long periods of time, multiple years, and at these levels of the day-to-day application in the field, the interaction between the so-called headquarters organization and the field, and then looking at it from a broader perspective of how do we extract information from this to learn what we need to do better and differently. And here's our after action review format. And basically what we're trying to do there is create what we now would call, per Amy Edmonds, a psychologically safe environment to be able to work in and to be able to conduct the action research and the actual deliver benefits to our clients. And so the questions, the core set of questions are typical of after action reviews that you can look up on the internet. There are a variety of websites and project reports that talk about it. The critical thing is being open and honest, looking at facts and data, and avoiding blame. It's not an issue of blame. It's say, what can we learn about this situation? And you put ranks, status, and politics aside to the greatest degree you're able to. Now, when you're working with NGOs and you're working in local politics and you're working in some cases with national politics, sometimes there are political issues that get involved. So for instance, when we were in Thailand, the Red Cross dropped the ball on the tsunami in a couple of ways. And but the Red Cross was run by the king. And so you couldn't be critical of the Red Cross. And so we had to work very delicately in terms of how we gave the Red Cross feedback. So it's not the politics is never there. It's not the power and status isn't there, but you try to be able to remove it and try to manage within your teams and within your NGO the psychological safety. Now, this is an important slide. And by the way, all these slides will be available to you afterwards. We had a micro-organizational role for action research. And that is that we're creating a body of insight, understanding, and experience to be able to guide specific projects. So that's one version of the action research we're doing. And then the next level is where we're creating a body of insight, understanding, and experience to be able to grow the font, the big pool of intellectual capital that we had as an organization. What are the lessons we can extract that we can apply to the whole of the organization across countries, across projects, and across years of work? And then the third thing that became an emphasis for us is that we were really trying to develop social entrepreneurs. We would have 100 and 150 people, young people, that we were taking on these projects every year on these country visits. And what we were trying to do is help them learn how to be constructive social entrepreneurs throughout the rest of their lifetime. And so that was one of the things we realized several years into our NGO, was that we were really about not just serving the poor, but we were about building up a cadre of social entrepreneurs that would, throughout their lives, be able to contribute to the productive humanitarian growth of people in developing world countries. Now I'm going to just share with you a couple of pictures about real world projects. You can see the picture on the left. You can see there are two people in front of me. I'm the third person on a small motorbike, a boda boda in Uganda. Not real high on safety, but it got us where we had to go back and forth because we had no vehicles of our own. And the driver that's there is somebody that drove for us frequently, and he's really a good friend. On the right, the guy on the left is Tim. He's a Marine Corps Iraq veteran. He was in Fallujah during one of the big fighting periods there. And he was my bodyguard, as well as being somebody in a PhD sociology program. And the guy in the middle is Isaac, who is the leader of an NGO called the Naja Education Center out in the boondocks outside of Lugazi, Uganda. And then I'm on the right. And what we're doing, we had a whole bunch of projects we did with Isaac and his education center. And I'm going to share one of them with you. And this project that we worked on was that we built an adobe stove for them to cook food for the children. Before, they were cooking over the open fire, which you can see over on the left. On the right is the finished stove. And it's a stove made out of mud. And what this does is that it reduces the amount of time cooking by 50%, reduces the amount of wood used by 50% by building a mud stove. And here you see the stove being built. We took banana stalks and put them in for the burners, where the burners would go. And then down on the sides, we put banana stalk going in for the wood chamber. And then on the very back is a flue that takes the gas out, the smoke and particulate matters out. On the right, you see the banana leaves and so forth. We've finished that stove and it's curing. And on the right bottom side, you see the volunteers there mixing the adobe with their feet. This was an exciting experience. And you can see the school children there too, helping in the building of the stove. So the children in the school and the teachers and our volunteers were all working together to build this great stove. Okay, so just kind of closing to say, does this really work? Yes, it does work. Our teams were focused on specific projects, discretionary coalition, or morphing temporary project teams. fluid membership, leadership roles. We had our volunteers with the local NGOs and the villagers. We had fluid role taking, highly flexible, highly adaptable, emergent, and we're de-emphasizing power and status with high levels of collaboration all the way across. And the focus is on getting work done and achieving outcomes, as well as what I said before, building the future entrepreneurs for the world. Example number one, Guatemala. Andrea Despain, one of the wonderful young volunteers, started libraries in villages for children. And a library was just a bookshelf with 50 books on it. But Andrea would go in and they would build the bookshelf. She would work with the villagers, find out if they wanted a library. If they did, get them involved in creating the bookshelf and in acquiring books. And then we had donors that would donate books for us to use in the libraries. The second one, El Salvador, Blanca Rodriguez, a wonderful young woman who went on to medical school. We had a lot of people being sent money from the US to their families in El Salvador. And there was a problem with getting them to spend the money wisely and well. So we created a program with the local communist mayor and city council, which was really fun to be working with communists. And we created skits and murals that demonstrated how remittance money could be used well. And then the third one is the Adobe stove. Natalie Rowe, a wonderful young woman, again, a senior in a university program, and she was called La Reina de las Estufas, or the person who was the queen of the stoves. And in the year that we were there, which was 2007, the one I was there, when Natalie was working, we worked with our local NGOs to create 45 stoves, and then the villagers with the local NGO created over 400 stoves. And remember, the outcome for the families, the wives and the children were not in a hut where they were cooking over an open fire, and so there was less respiratory damage. You had 50% less fuel, 50% less time spent, and we would take the extra time that the mothers had, and we would teach them entrepreneurship, help them start businesses. And so the Adobe stove was a tool, a gateway to be able to have these people creating economic independence through small business. And the whole underpinning was using this action research model. Okay. Anybody have any quick questions you want to ask?
I don't have a question, Pete, but it's a wonderful example and a beautiful experience. Thank you for sharing it.
Thank you. Adel, could you talk to us?
I have a question about how did you create a container where you were able to help the locals set aside rank and status? Because I'm originally from Malaysia and I'm familiar with some of the nuances in certain parts of the world, especially Southeast Asia, and status is so important.
Yes.
There. So for a leader to put that aside instead of to demand, well, there are protocols about respect and, my voice is bigger than yours. How did you do that?
Well, what I'll say first off is that every country and culture that we went into was characterized by what I would call machismo, male domination. And women tended to not have as much latitude in terms of respect and contribution. And so the way we dealt with it was by working with local NGOs who had a values stance of empowering women. If you go and look at the information on microcredit, which we were engaged in frequently, 95 to 98% of the loans in microcredit are given to women because women use it more responsibly to benefit the families. And so, quite frankly, the way we dealt with it was by partnering with local NGOs that already had the same value set that we had, and then working with them, having a knowledge of the local cultures to be able to work persuasively with people around empowering women. It was not easy. It was not necessarily smooth sledding all the way, but we were very deliberate about that. It was a significant underlying theme was empowering women, and we would work tangentially to the local culture and political systems. But it's something you got to be really careful about, and it has to be a specific design assumption that you go into. It's a specific characteristic of your action research. It's one of the assumptions you build in to your action research process. Is that helpful, Adel?
It is helpful. And I'm transferring it to even here in the North American setting, where I've always been in organizations where I'm not in leadership.
Yes.
And so to lead from a position of a follower,
yes,
it's really tough, especially if it's top-down type hierarchical organization. So I'm curious to see what else you're going to share here.
If I could be so frank, this approach has an element of guerrilla warfare. Okay, it's an element of insurgency. And I don't mean that from a revolutionary overthrow of the government perspective, but from the perspective of you can't take the power structure that exists in an organization or a culture on head on. You have to work tangentially. And that was the premise or assumption that we worked on. Okay, Stu, let's talk about your example, the Star Lab, and a little bit different than the humanitarian example, but nonetheless hugely powerful.
Okay, thanks, Pete. I'm going to go through this quickly, as fast as I can, so that we can have more time at the end to talk as a group. So I'll kind of go over the slides here at a high level. What I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about action research. Pete has done that, but there's a few points that I think are real important for all of us to probably discuss. And you want to go back? That slide? Yeah, then I'm going to talk about 3 cases, and I just want to mention because this has to do with action research. The Star Labs case, Social Technical Action Research, is a very large 10-company action research project that has the academic side to it and also has the practice side to it. The Fairview case is an action research project that's all about solving a performance problem. And one of the points I want to make in this talk is that action research, when you use it and implement it as a basis for doing a project, it almost always invariably improves performance, measurable performance. I have one case to show you, but I can probably give you, in fact, every single project, including one that I'm doing right now, you always organize it as an action research project in order to achieve the objectives that the client wants you to achieve. And then the last case is the digital social technical design. And the key point here to understand is that in digital organization design, action research is really not a choice. It's really the way that you design new systems. In other words, action research in digital design is actually how you do the design. It's all based on the ability for rapid reconfigurability, and continuous learning. So action research now has been embedded into the actual design process when you're implementing new technology and new novel organizational models. So those are three examples, and we'll go over those three. So if we go to the next slide, all I want to do here is, and Pete has basically mentioned this, you know, in terms of what action research is, and just to go over the model that he went over, but just to go over it again. If you think of action research as a systems model, in other words, inputs, transformation, outputs, feedback loop. If you only have inputs and transformation and outputs, it's a dumb system. It doesn't learn. You have a feedback loop, it has the ability to learn. So on the input side, there's usually planning and data gathering and the feedback of results. In the action, in the middle part of it, the process is where the action steps are taken. You make a change in the process, you make a change in what you're doing. It's all based on learning. And then you move to output, which is really data gathering and measurement. And then there's feedback loop, which takes a look at the gap and the difference between where you are and where you want to be. So setting up a systems model in every consulting project you have always leads towards greater insight and higher performance. To give you just a very quick example, when I was down at ATC in the 1980s, and this was a research group, the research that came out, part of the research that came out that really fascinated me was that there's three characteristics of organizations that always lead to productivity. One is participative goal setting. The other one is discretion, moving decision-making down, and the other one is feedback loops. So in other words, if you go into any organization and you engage the people in participatively setting objectives, and then you push down capability so that they can make they can make decisions. And of course, you have to push down information and skills and decision-making. And then you create a feedback loop. That system will always improve, will always increase its productivity, always improve. So I learned that very early on and have used that ever since in almost everything I do. So action research is really a key piece. So if we go to the next slide, the Star Labs project, I think many of you probably are familiar with it. Well, let's see. Jay Galbraith and I were doing a project in the Silicon Valley, and the one thing that we noticed that there was a technology lead social system lag situation going on. You had fifth generation technology and second generation organizational models, and the gap was widening. And we felt that this is a major issue. So I talked to some folks, and namely some of those you probably know. Bill Passmore came out, and Sue Moorman at USC, and Chris Worley at USC, and we formed this action research project. If you go to the next slide, which we pulled together a whole bunch of companies, major companies across the world, Google and Microsoft and Amazon, and Stanford got involved. We had a Chinese company and also a Indian company. Shell and Nike were involved. So these are Deutsche Bank. They're all very large companies. In each company, we asked to have a tech person and a software person, a P&L person, an OD and an HR person. And we went and we created this action research project. If you go to the next slide, the model that we had, and I'm not going to go over this in detail because it's just too much detail for our conversation now, but you know, the left-hand side are all the inputs that we talked about, this middle of the actions, and then out on the right-hand side of the outputs, and then you have a feedback loop. So it's essentially gathering data, then creating, working differently, doing just something differently, executing that, and then getting feedback as to how you performed, and then learning, and then that learning results in changing again. So this whole thing was done with 10 companies, but it was the same model that we've been talking about. So I won't, it was a big project, and it was engaging all of these people for about a year and a half, and we learned a lot. There were a lot of research papers that came out of this and other things. If you move to the next slide, just one example of a document that came out, which was out of some of the interviewing that we did, is that all these areas of organization design were having to change in the traditional organizational model when you added digital technology. So the hierarchies and networks that whole thing was starting to shift. Efficiency and optimization was moving more towards ambidextrous models. Scaling became very, very important, fast scaling, which is a big issue in the Silicon Valley. Front back, the customer became dominant in these cases. It became the front part of the organization, and the ecosystem was now becoming an area of design. So there were a lot of changes to the traditional organizational model. The biggest change was the fact that digital technology was changing information processing, the information processing algorithm, which is the whole basis of organization design. So we learned a lot in that project, but it was all action research. So if you go to the next slide, the Fairview project, and let me describe it here real quick. You want to go back to the next slide? Yeah, just keep it there for a second. Let me just provide you the context. The CEO of the company and the state was trying to move all their clinics to what they called a medical home, which was a new high-performing way to reduce cost, improve clinical outcomes, and improve the patient experience. And I worked with them on creating 2 prototypes. And the prototypes were indeed quite good. In other words, they were better than all the other clinics, not only in the company, but in the state in terms of performance. So the question was, how do you now change the other 45 clinics based on the 2 prototypes that you have? And the 2 prototypes took about 14 months to do. So if you take 14 months and you take about, the cost $1 million+, it's going to take a long time and a lot of money to change the other 45 clinics. So the basic idea was, well, wait a second, we can use an action research project and do it much, much faster and do it with higher performance. And they said, well, how do you do that? So what we did is we took a prototype and we identified what we call all the functionalities. In other words, in any kind of software development activity or any product design, it's filled with functionalities for the customer. So each medical clinic had about 48 functionalities. So the question was, we had to build those 48 functionalities into the other 45 clinics. So what we did is we rented the Coliseum downtown. We got the 45 clinics in a room. We had a way for them to see the top 15 functionalities. All of the clinics sent people into the functionalities, and they identified a 30, 60, 90-day iteration plan of what functionalities they would develop every 30 days. So the whole idea was that these 45 clinics, every 30 days, would be creating and changing the design for these functionalities. And then they would go to the next iteration. If one of the functionalities became a best practice, it changed the metric for all the other functionalities. So they were learning from each other. At the end of 10 months, the state came in and evaluated the project, and Mayo Clinic had, I think, 3 clinics done, and Alina had 3 or 4, and Health Partners had 5 or 6, and so forth. But Fairview had all 48 clinics done at the highest level of performance. So there were a bunch of academics that came in and wrote papers. There was some medical papers that were written on it because the transformation was so fast and so profound. And we fundamentally used an action research project. And that action research project is on the next slide. So on this project, on this model, this is a model that we've used for the last 20 years or so. But what it is, if you have below the action research model, inputs, outputs, feedback, and then change. At the top, what we have is that and we don't need to get into this, but these are all design libraries. So for example, as you're doing the project, if you need to do experience design, you pull that in. If you need to do product design, you pull those capabilities in. They're all tools and techniques that you pull into the action research model in order to achieve your objective. But the action research model basically says that a leader has a performance issue or an issue that they're trying to change. It's their strategy. You mobilize by getting all of the people involved in that particular issue. And those people are not only members of the company, but they're also members of the ecosystem. They're also customers, and also people that have deep expertise in the type of problem you're dealing with. And you get them all in a room and you rapidly prototype a solution for about a day and a half. And then what comes out of that are teams that will do this action research project for the next 30, 60, 90, 120 days, and so on and so forth. So they act, and then they adapt, and then they come back and they act and they adapt, and they do that as fast as you can. Whoever, and because the faster you do it, you increase the learning rate and you increase the implementation to meeting your objectives. So the model was quite successful. The whole project was measured. There's some papers if you want it. I can send you some papers on it. But the point that I'm just trying to make here is that this is action research. It's all an action research model. Okay, if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to say a couple things on this because this could take a whole day. But as you know, digital technology is coming to the play. You know, the big issue is that digital technology is fundamentally changing not only how organizations are designed, but also the organization design process. The way that you design organizations is changing very, very rapidly, and we can talk for a long time about that, but it's having a big impact. Now, if you move to the next slide, the model that is the digital organization design model to redesign an organization. This is the model that we've been using for the last 3 to 5 years, about five or 6 years actually. And it looks very similar to what we just looked at, you know, where you have leadership, strategy, the business model now in digital design. The business model now becomes the most critical part of this. Strategies don't last very long. They're very, very temporary right now. They used to be annual, they used to be semi-annual, used to be quarterly, used to be monthly, and now they're changing on almost like a day-by-day basis. The business model is really what drives the organization, the value prop, benefits minus cost, and the profit formula, and the organization design. The organization, the technology, process, and people are constantly reconfigured to meet for the business model. But the point, I don't want to get too deep into this, but the point is that you have input, you have a reconfigurable process of technology, people, and process. Then you have the outputs, which are goals and metrics and outputs, and of course, outputs for the user outputs, customer user requirements. A feedback loop where you engage the ecosystem, and then you reconfigure all over again. So the major issue here is that the new organizational models, action research is not a choice, it's fundamentally the way that you design. You design and you embed action research into the process. So if you go to the next slide, and then go, we won't talk about this now, but go to the next slide, and you can look at this at your own time at another time, but the next slide. So this last slide, there's a number of things in here. Relentless pursuit of continuous improvement, that's action research. Build, measure, learn, and pivot. Experiment and test the vision, that's action research. Gather and implement customer feedback, that's action research. So in these new high-powered, artificial intelligence-driven digital organizational models, action research is really the engine that drives performance. So it's really front and center. Okay, if you go to the last slide, that's it. Thank you very much.
Questions for Stu?
I have two questions. The first question is regarding the wheel that you were showing, Stu, with the different parts that were connected challenges, I think you call them.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm curious about how you demonstrated in type of a logic model type of way, how they were interconnected. Were you able to tell the story about how these things were interconnected and sort of like either supportive of the transformation that you wanted to achieve or in the way of the transformation?
Yeah. So what we did is that when collecting data, we noticed that these were all the features of a traditional organization that were under change. And they had impacts, they were interdependent with one another. So we wrote research papers about each one of these, and we identified the interdependencies that they had. So for example, ambidexterity and hierarchies and networks were very, very interdependent.
And did you show that through sort of identifying processes that were interdependent or outcomes, or what were you naming as the interdependence?
Well, a lot of them are processes because they have to do with if you change one thing or you change it, one aspect, it's going to have an impact on another organizational feature. So for example, when you use digital technology, what digital technology does is it very rapidly increases the interdependencies between tasks. So tasks that used to be designed around jobs and were fairly independent now become very, very interdependent, which means that you change the roles of people. And you also increase more towards interdependent team units, which has to do with how you change the way that you reward these people and how you organize these people. It flattens the hierarchy. The hierarchies get much more flattened. The governance structures become not leadership structures, but governance structures that hover. I mean, I can go on and on and on and on, but there's a lot of interdependencies, and it makes it much more complex, of course, because of the interdependencies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much. I also have a quick question about your second to last slide where you talked about open system features.
Yeah.
So next slide, Pete. Thank you. Yeah. So which of these features would you say, and I know this is probably a swiping generalization as an answer, but which of these features would you say was most likely to support the transformation that you were working on?
Right now, let me give you an example. Right now, I'm working with a company, and we're prototyping with their CEO a project. And there's a team of internal people that are working on this. And what I'm doing is I'm rapidly getting them to form these work units that have where all the structural properties of the unit in. So if you look at the 1, 2, 3, 4th bullet down where it says build, measure, learn, pivot, experiment, test, and vision. Once I get that built in this system, in other words, once I get a group of people once I get this action research model, the feedback loop, the inputs, the outputs, the feedback loop, and the people organized, once I have that in place, then we can start really making some major change. But I've got to get that in place first. Because once I get that action research model in, and most of these systems don't have the structural properties in place to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Once I can get it and they start humming, we can measure, we can learn, we can pivot, we can experiment. Once I can get that in, and I can do that pretty fast now, as soon as we get that in place, we can do all sorts of things in terms of improving the organization and making change. So the answer to your question would be that bullet. It would be to get in the system where we have metrics, we got feedback loops, we got the customer involved, we got the ecosystem members involved, and we got a way that we can talk to one another and experiment and execute quickly. So anyway.
Awesome. Thank you.
Adel, why don't you ask your question?
I have a quick clarification question for the Fairview case. You were saying that you get all the stakeholders together in a room and you do a rapid prototype thing for a day and a half.
Yeah.
And then you said after that, what comes out of that are the teams that will do the action research project. So my question to you is, are those teams doing the action research project? Are those teams made up of the people who are in the room doing the prototyping, or is it then, farmed out to others? And how important is it for people who are doing the action research to be part of the prototyping?
Good question. So all the members of the clinics were in this large room. Okay. And let's go after that large room event, let's go 30 days later. 30 days later, 6 of those clinics came into a room and we had a review. And a clinic stood up and they said, our process this week was to improve functionality 5, 7, 9, 12, and 6. And this is how we did. And we had some doctors and we had some clinic people and patients, and they looked and they said, you did really well on 5, you did really well on 7, you did 6. Number 9 wasn't too good. You got to throw that back into the product backlog. So then the clinic would say, okay, well, we got 4 done now. Now we go to the next 30 days. And then the next clinic would do that. So what they did is they started building the functionality in their clinic because they had to get these new 45 functionalities. But what they did is that after they did the review, the one day when they went in for the review, it took about 3 hours to do the review. They also learned about what variances are getting in the way of them performing. We call it the variances. In other words, they might not be getting the talent they need. They may need some resources. They would have the next 30 days to smooth out those variances in order to get more functionality accepted. But the thing is that they also noticed that if there was another clinic that did better than they did, they could learn from that clinic because we had materials and videos that we were creating for each of these clinics. So instead of you as a clinic going through these 48 functionalities and learning them, you were going through, but you were also leveraging all the other 45, 46 clinics and how they were doing it so you could learn faster. So it took 18 months or 14 months for the first clinic, but this way they can do it all in parallel. They were all learning at the same time. So all 48 clinics could learn at the same time, and we did it in 10 months.
So it was kind of double learning, as in it may not have happened with my own clinic, but I can learn from somebody else's clinic. But the people who were putting out the experiment in my own clinic, I was earlier invited to that stakeholder group to do the.
Oh, you and some of the patients.
And okay.
Yeah, all by the way, everything that we're talking about with action research, none of it works unless the people that are doing the work are the people who are involved and make the decisions.
Right. Ownership.
Oh, ownership. The only way that it doesn't, any top-down situation does not work. The essence of this whole process, the essence of action research, is that you get the key stakeholders engaged in driving the process. And if they're not engaged, then it won't work.
And that's the example in our humanitarian work, use the same principle where we were getting local NGOs, local non-government organizations, local nonprofits, and the villagers involved in the process.
I always start with 3 questions. Who has the information necessary? Who can influence or impact the alternative? And who will be impacted?
Yeah, that's it.
Those are and the answer to those 3 questions gives you the stakeholder maps who's talking about to figure out who needs to be on this action learning, action research journey. Who has the information, who can influence it, meaning blow it up or make it work, right? And who will be impacted, right? And so, and it's a whole systems view from customers and suppliers. When you're looking at it, it's not confined to the organizational entity, but the ecosystem in which it exists, right?
Yep, that's right. That's great, Paul.
And that's got to be a core feature of any action research process.
Tracy's got a question.
Go ahead, Tracy.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. What were the digital tools that you were using to manage your backlog? And were you using Kanban? Like, were you tracking what was being moved to a done column?
You mean, you're talking about the Fairview case when we created the teams? Yeah, we had that's a good question. Those teams are agile, they're agile teams. And we used way back then, it was all done manually. We had all of our, we had to put in an IT system earlier so we captured the data. But we had all of their, all the functionalities were online. Every time we had a review and a retrospective, we had their product backlogs all lined up. This was back in 2014. That was a while back.
So were you using like Post-it notes on flip chart paper, or was there a digital environment where you were managing the backlog?
We didn't have Post-its. We had posters that we were using. We had made posters, and each of the teams had posters that they were using, and they would write into the posters. This is a little not quite answering your question, but one of the major issues that we had in this process was a capacity plan, because all these clinics didn't quite have the right capacity to execute on all the functionalities. So what we had to do is we had to make sure that they did capacity plans to be able to make sure that they can execute on what they wanted to execute on. Sorry about this phone here.
Yeah, I'm just, I'm curious about the current reality that we're in and bridging the face-to-face world with the digital world. So I'm always curious about the digital tools that support this kind of work. And I guess my next question, it's kind of an overarching question that you're welcome to respond to, Stu, but it's really more for Peter and the previous presentation. I work in a government context, and so we need to demonstrate accountability. We need to be able to track back the decisions that we made. And so, action research generates so much data, and it's really hard to, make good decisions about how to leave the breadcrumbs behind and how to, roll things up and summarize and report back. And I just wonder, how did you leave those breadcrumbs behind after you exited the client system or after you finished up your project or, a segment of it? Can you just talk a little bit more about how you demonstrate accountability and how you report back, either formats, digital tools, approaches that you used?
Yeah. A couple things. One is that there wasn't a lot of digital tools when we did this project. And the reason why is, number one, is that we were in healthcare. This wasn't in the Silicon Valley. This was back in the state of Minnesota. So we didn't have a lot of digital tools. It was in healthcare. And the other thing I didn't mention is that we did a 30, 60, 90, and then we got everybody back together again in the large kind of Coliseum. And we had all the data all up on the walls. This was like a 7,000 square foot room. We had all the data on the walls that people can take a look at the data. We brought all the data was brought to every time we had a review. The reviews were done with like 6 teams at a time. Because we called them neighborhoods. And each neighborhood came together and we did a review, and it usually lasted a day and a half or so. And then we had a central IT system, which you could go online and you can go and find your data and everybody else's data online. And then we also had a training and development group that was constantly collecting data and formalizing it, but also collecting data and making it into tools and new processes. The functionalities had to get codified so we can repeat them very, very quickly. So it was a big, big deal because there was a lot of complexity and a lot of moving parts all at one time. Now, if you go into some of these digital companies now, all of this is digital. Everything that we're talking about is all digital. And the real issue that I'm finding is digital IQ. It's the ability to people to be able to read data, understand data, make sense out of data, and then act on the data. So it's the opposite problem that we have now that we had before. So anyway.
And with our humanitarian example, we had virtually no electronic tools. We had text messaging on cell phones and some level of email. But when we're talking about working in villages and even working with some of the local NGOs, we didn't even have Post-it notes. You had 8.5 by 11 paper and a pair of scissors and some tape, and that was you work with the tools that you have, but the basic underlying logic and thinking process unifies, is consistent, is a thread through whether you have electronic data processing, ICT or not. And so that's one of the major things is figuring out. Go ahead, Paul.
No, I'm laughing, Pete, because in India we actually had to make flip charts. they didn't even know what they were.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we literally had to build flip charts because they had no idea what they were. And they loved the idea of them when they finally saw them, right? But because they had no visual way of tracking anything, and or common communication platform or tool. So this handmade flip chart became the network node, if you will, right? Where people would post questions, they'd post answers. I put in the chat box, they would create simple fishbone diagrams where they would get other people to, as they walk by, to input into them. They'd hang them on the side wall of the main building in the village, right? Yeah, exactly.
Whatever industry
Thank you.
you go to, you can see the sophistication, and back when we did this project and I was using some of these agile techniques, they had never heard of the word or even the concepts. I mean, it was just, I brought it in, it was totally new. And some places just aren't using any kind of digital technology at all. In fact, a lot of legacy companies that are in other industries don't do that at all. So then you go to the Silicon Valley, and I mean, they're way out there.
There is
Thank
something to be said for stuff being, Tracy, hung up on the wall that's more visceral, right?
Yeah.
Where people can actually see it, touch it. In one of the action research projects I did, we literally, even making the final decision about what the design of the organization would be, there were 3 choices, and each choice took up a whole wall that people could go touch, feel, put Post-its to in a more visceral way, right? And when it came to the voting, they had a green dot and a red dot, and they had to go and there was a big debate about, do we vote virtually and electronically? Do we use a little keypad and everybody do it secretly? Do we have them go physically put it up on the wall? What builds the ownership and the commitment, and how do you do that, right? So how do you migrate some of that visceral to mural or Miro, or, that's a real challenge, right?
Yeah, and that's the moment that we're in. I work in a context, I'm working with a community of 10,000 people spread out across, Canada's provinces and Northern Territories. And so, the preference for me has always been physical and live, and there's no replacement for human memory and storytelling and energetics in the room. And so I'll just share with the group, being a socio-technical systems roundtable, we as practitioners need to become very adept at what's available, and also what our client needs, in terms of archiving and artifacts. And so I was very limited being in the Canadian Public Service of what I could access, but I could access Slido. And so I did run some unique design search conferences in Slido. And then it was the client system themselves who were doing their own sense making of the data in small groups. And then, it was just a matter of kind of tidying it up and making it nice and tight as a feedback report to leave behind in the archives, because public servants are also famous for really losing the plot. I mean, they may have been in the room, but if 2 weeks goes by, you got to remind them and have some kind of artifact of remember how we talked about this and we decided that.
Yes.
So
I mean, there are good websites like Liberating Structures, right, and others where imagining actually, it's a little bit of what you were saying about, it's imagining how could we have the dialogue, right, virtually in a way that would recreate somewhat of that physical experience, right? And the Liberating Structures and some of there's a couple of other sites like that where people are positing, putting activities and dialogue, conversations and tools that you could use for some of them. Some of those are really, really good.
Nisreen, you have a question, please ask.
Yeah, I was more so just a comment around the digital tools. So I'm located in Montreal, and the vast majority of our teams are across the country. And a lot of the work I do ends up being on Mural. So when I'm interviewing our clients and collecting the data is on Mural. And I actually find Mural is an excellent tool for that because it gives you the option to make the room anonymous so people can contribute without their names being shown. And so you can still get, of course, it's not the same as being in person, but given the fact that I have no choice and a lot of my projects are going to be virtual, I find Mural is a fantastic tool. I know there's a cost associated compared to Miro, which is free, but I find as a collaboration tool, it is fantastic.
And we're going to be using Mural as one of the ways of documenting what we're doing in the conference in September. So thank you, Nasreen, for talking about that. We found it to be a really valuable tool in planning the conference, and for executing the conference, it'll be the same. Paul, could you make some concluding comments for her? We've chewed up our time, and it's been an absolute delight. Yes, Mural is a bit complicated for new users.
Well, there's a couple of things. The first is, the three of us sort of represent a historical perspective, right? So you look at, Eric Trist didn't know any other way other than action learning and action research. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Deming. PDCA cycle is nothing more than an action research model, right? He gave me a lecture on how to use the PDCA from the first to the 55th floor in the Tokyo Imperial Hotel. Cole McIntyre and Ruben talk about how people learn. I think, when you peel the onion in any org design process, it is an action research, action learning methodology, or it ought to be. It shouldn't be prescriptive, right? You iterate your way to the future is what we said. And there's lots of examples. You heard a bunch, I have a bunch, where the idea is to bring together the constellation of stakeholders in a way that builds ownership and commitment. And Cooper Ryder said, you discover first, right? That's the get the data, learn, right? Then you dream, imagine what's possible. Then you decide, and then you do, right? And that's action research. It's essentially an action research, action learning model. He just called it the 4Ds, right? Deming called it PDCA. And I think if you're not practicing action research and action learning, you're probably doing yourself and the system a disservice, because it's what enables people to learn from each other and to leverage the wisdom of the whole in order to do it. That's why I always love Stu's cases, especially Fairview, right, where people are being able to leverage what they know and learn from each other in a way that makes the whole system much smarter, right? And I think that's probably the bottom line, Pete.
Mm-hmm. Yep. This has been a delight. It didn't go as we kind of planned it, but I hope that you found it to be beneficial.
Big jump.
And we're going to have a virtual water cooler on Thursday of this week. We would invite you to that. And then on Tuesday, the 28th, we're going to have my birthday party. I'll be turning 75. And Nancy has generously offered to talk about the 3 conversations that include deliberation, that include dialogue. And we're going to talk about discretionary coalitions and deliberation, and how these 3 conversations are critical by building trust, establishing dialogue or common definitions of reality, and then engaging in problem solving. And the thesis that Nancy and I will be presenting is that until you establish trust and common definition, you're not going to be able to do good problem solving and decision making.
Pete, before we close, I just, on behalf of the roundtable, I just want to make one comment, if I could.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think it was really exciting this morning or this afternoon for some, to have the folks from the HSI program here. I mean, and all made fantastic contributions in their questions and comments in terms of bringing this into the present day. And in that respect, for the HSI folks particularly, I would like to highlight that the roundtable has been developing over the last year and a half a mentorship program, which you can learn about on our website. And some of the folks you've met in this room, like Paul and Pete, are mentors in this program. So if you want to continue this dialogue as it relates to your work, Nisreen or others, the mentorship program, you might find that a useful sort of support structure. But thank you very much. I mean, it's wonderful to see you folks here.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for an amazing presentation and dialogue.
And thank you to Paul and Stu for your historical good work and your willingness to share and engage. And I'm always delighted with it. And so,
A lot of fun. Our pleasure.
yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, take care.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for your work and your wisdom. See you next time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye,
Look
Tracy.
forward to it, Tracy.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Take care, Stu. Keep getting well. That's great.
Yeah. See you later, Bert.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Paddle, thank you very much too for your comments. I don't know the app. I got to go find the app.
Enjoy the sunshine down there, Paul.
You know, it's been foggy for the last 5 days, and all of a sudden yesterday the sun started to come back out. So,
Yeah, we're
and my dog discovered the beach, right?
Yeah.
The dog is like, oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
She's
gonna go.
pretty
I'm
fun.
gonna get off this. I'm gonna go down and see my surfing buddies right now. They're usually
There you
down
go. That sounds like a good plan.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So whenever I have a slide deck, whenever you're ready for it, Pete.
Okay, great. Hey guys, thanks a lot. Did you make changes to your slide deck, Paul? Or can
No.
I? No. Okay, I'll
No.
go ahead and send them out to the
That's
participants.
super. That's super. Super. That'd be great.
Good to see
Yeah,
you guys. Thanks for
You do
collaborating.
well. All right. You
Take
got
care.
it. Take care. Talk to you guys later.
Bye.
Bye.